name is Sadi from Olympian High School. We'll be using the Traditions and Encounters textbooks to study Islamic resurgence in Southwest Asia and North Africa. So just real quickly, make sure you understand that Southwest Asia means the Middle East. It's just another way of referring to the Middle East. And you should know where North Africa is. Okay, so after World War II, we know that Arab nationalism increases, intensifies, and alongside that, you have different kinds of Arab nationalism. One kind is pan-Arab nationalism, the kind embodied by the leader of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who you know about. But pan-Arabism assumes a sort of unity that really didn't always exist in the Arab community. There are reasons for that. One reason is the Cold War. Some Arab countries, and when I say Arab countries, it doesn't mean everyone's Arab there, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're all Muslim. So there's a lot of variation in these countries, but by and large, the majority of the population is Arab and is usually Muslim. But within these countries, they were often choosing different sides of the Cold War, or they would switch sides. So Egypt started off as being part of the Soviet sphere, and in the 1970s switches to the side of the United States, and that's going to create division. And there's also a split religiously. Just because you're Muslim doesn't mean you high five and skip off into the sunset. You're all buddies. You have Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims, so there's a big difference there. So you have this first introductory paragraph telling you about pan-Arabism and the increased nationalism, and then it goes into the reality of the fact that the Arabs weren't always united, and it talks about some of those reasons that I just mentioned. Okay, next you have the issue of Israel, right? How different countries perceive Israel is going to cause a problem. There are many conflicts surrounding Israel. So obviously you have the Nakba, or the 1948 War for Independence, depending on what side you agree with. There's the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. There's the 1973 Arab-Israeli or Yom Kippur War. All of these things increase tensions in the region. And Egypt is going to change its attitude towards Israel, which is going to impact pan-Arab nationalism. So around Israel are other Arab countries that are very interested in the rights of the Palestinian people to return and fairness for the Palestinian Arabs. Okay, so when Gamal Abdel Nasser was in power, he was very much, into the rights of the Palestinian people and had a negative relationship with Israel. Anwar Sadat, who is going to succeed Gamal Abdel Nasser as the leader of Israel, masterminds or is behind the Yom Kippur surprise attack. But then he changes his policies and starts to get closer to the United States instead of the Soviet Union. So he renounces the nation's friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, and he starts to decide to move closer towards peace with Egypt's neighbor, Israel, which is going to infuriate some Arabs that are really upset with the Jewish Israelis who, killed many people, and there were a lot of refugees. And I'm not saying there weren't violence on both sides, but of course there's a lot of resentment, there's a lot of suffering that took place. So many Arabs see this as a betrayal, and ultimately Anwar Sadat will be assassinated by people that opposed his policies towards Israel. An organization called the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, is going to try to isolate Egypt politically. You have the leader of the PLO at the time, Yasser Arafat, trying to support Palestinian rights. Anytime Palestinians and Israelis were getting close to agreement and peace, extremists would complicate the issue, and there would be assassinations. So, for example, the Israeli prime minister is also going to be assassinated for making steps towards supporting Palestinian rights and Palestinian self-rule, Yitzhak Rabin. And if you're allowed to watch this, there is a YouTube video where it almost seems like his bodyguards move out of the way to allow for his assassination. And I watched that video in an upper division history class when I was getting my master's from an Israeli professor who was teaching this. And it was really, really interesting. There's obviously it's not conclusive what we know, but the fact is that many of the people who were more moderates, more in the middle, end up being killed or assassinated. And so that leaves people that are very extreme and passionate on the outer edges of these opinions more hostile to each other. And so there's this complication of how Arab states feel about Israel and the issue of Israel. And we see this also in the creation of an institution called Hezbollah. Hezbollah, by some people, is seen as an organization that fights against Israel, against the oppressive policies of Israel, and by others, it's seen as a terrorist organization. I visited Lebanon in 2018, the same year I visited Iraq, And there is a part where there's a lot of support within Lebanon for Hezbollah, but again, many people say this is a terrorist organization. So you'll read in your book about Hezbollah, and sometimes this has led to outright war between Lebanon and Israel. And this gets really complicated, so I don't want to go down the rabbit hole here too long, but know that there has been a resurgence of interest in anything that will help assist pan-Arabism or Arab nationalism, Arab solidarity. One of the expressions of that interest and passion is Islamism, not to be confused with Islam. So I grew up Muslim. Someone who's Muslim is someone who practices Islam. We know that Islam is a monotheistic religion coming out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. So to be Muslim is not to be an Islamist. Islamism is a political ideology that has at its core a desire for a state that is Islamic, completely different. And some Islamists are some Islamists are more conservative, and others are more extreme. So be careful not to generalize and say that all Muslims are Islamists. That's not true. Some want a secular state. They don't want an Islamic state. They want the separation there. And also be careful not to think of all Islamists as being extremists or people that would resort to terrorist policies. So Islamists are people that were attracted to the idea of using Islamic values and ideas to create a state. They have a notion that there's been some decadence within the Islamic world, that Western ideas and Western cultural norms and economic policies and secularization have led to a deterioration of the Arab world, the Islamic world. And there's also a disillusionment, anger, and there's reasons for that. Some Americans seem to express disbelief that, they say things like, why do they hate us? First of all, that's assuming a they and then us, and that gets really complicated. But there were bombings of some of these areas. There was the support of the United States in terms of weapons against some of these groups who wanted to rid themselves of imperialism in the past. So there's all this history. There's a long history of reasons for why people in the Arab world have felt like they can't trust the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Okay, some Islamists are extremists, and they take a Muslim idea called jihad, which some Muslims interpret as a desire to fight against evil within yourself, and other Muslims interpret as a duty to fight against incorrect ideas of Islam, or even, at its most extreme, as a duty to engage in religious war against people that would attack the Muslim community. You have some Islamists are going to attack the state of Iran. I should have pulled up a map of Iran, but just for now, know that Iran is right next to Iraq. But I'm actually a quarter Iranian, but Iranians are not considered the quote-unquote same race, if you believe in the concept of race. Iranians they come from Indo-European people, and Arabs are Semitic, like Jews. So Arabs don't really see themselves as being similar to Iranians, even though they practice the same religion of Islam. And also, you should know that the modern state of Iran is a minority kind of Muslim called Shia Muslim. Shia, Shiite, however you pronounce it in English, but Shia Muslim. So most Arabs in the world and most Muslims in the world, even people who aren't Arab, are Sunni. And then there's a small group in Iraq that are Shia, and obviously Iran, the government, is Shia. So you should know that there's this difference between Iranians and Iraqis. That's going to become important later when we talk about Iranians in the Iran-Iraq war. So anyway, long story short, there was a leader there who had come to power with the assistance of the United States through the CIA support, and his name is Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and he did a lot of things that benefited the United States. Obviously, the United States was very interested in Iran's oil industry. He becomes a bastion of anti-communism, meaning a defender of anti-communism. So that's important for the United States within the context of the Cold War. But there were many groups that disliked the Shah's secular regime. Shias didn't like him. There were a lot of people that didn't like his policy towards corporations and sort of favoring the influence of U.S. corporations. So there will be a revolution that takes place in 1979. that brings to power an Islamist, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This revolution was largely anti the US for many reasons, and the Shah will flee to the United States for medical treatment. The United States accept him, and in retaliation, some of these extremists who led the revolution capture 69 US hostages and keep them hostage until 1981. They also are going to confiscate some US-owned economic businesses, and they're going to basically try to change the state to a state that is more Islamist in nature. Next to Iran is Iraq. Notice how I'm pronouncing these states, by the way. I'm not saying Iran and Iraq. It's Iran and Iraq, or Iraq. But anyway, try to pronounce them closer. You do your best to how they're actually pronounced. So you have next to Iran the state of Iraq, which is where I'm from. Okay, I was born in Kuwait, but I'm from Iraq. There, the leader's name was Saddam Hussein. This is, I don't like to be evaluative or judgy in any of my teaching, but this was a man who often killed his own people. So he killed a minority group called the Kurds in the north. He attacked Shia Muslims in the south. So on his own, there was a lot of issues with him. He also hasn't had at the time, because he's going to be killed later, he had a desire to make himself like a leader of the pan-Arab nationalist movement, to be like a Gamal Abdel Nasser. So what he does is he takes advantage of the chaos that's taking place in Iran and decides to attack Iran, hoping it will be a swift war and would give Iraq access to Iranian oil supplies and enrich Iraq. Remember, Iran is not seen as being similar to Iraq because Iranians are, even though they're Muslim, they're Shia Muslim, and they're also a different quote-unquote race, right? They're Indo-European, not Semitic. So long story short, this ends up being a protracted battle that impoverishes both Iran and Iraq and leads to untold suffering by the people. It lasts 8 years, 1980 to 1988. So this is also going to increase Islamist interest. And eventually there's going to be, this is just telling you about who comes to power within Iran. And it tells you about Ahmadinejad taking power in 2005 and flouting Iran's nuclear program and his antipathy or dislike of the state of Israel. And so there's some changes in Iran, but you still see this movement that it's still an Islamist state. This is just when Khomeini dies. And then I really dislike this sentence in your book. It says Iraqis continued on a militant course. This is not cool. This is trying to say that Iraqis are their government. It would be like saying that every American, agreed with the president, whether that president was Trump or Biden, and that's not the case, right? Sometimes the government is separate from the people. I want you guys to remember to make that distinction so that you don't start making assumptions about other people. Many Iraqis were not interested in war, but the Iraqi government is going to continue to engage in war. Now, here's where there's a lot of details that get left out that I don't want to go too deep into, but this is my personal interest because I'm from here, so I'm going to share with you a couple of things that you may not know that's not in the book. First, you should know that what's going to happen is Saddam Hussein is going to invade Kuwait because there's a lot of oil there, and this will lead to a coalition invading Iraq, and this will lead to the first Gulf War because there will be another Gulf War. When this happens, before this happens, it's important to talk about a U.S. diplomat named April Gillespie. I see that I froze. Sorry, that looked weird. April Gillespie, this is controversial, but if you look at the historiography of how the Iraq War unfolded or the Gulf War unfolded, there was a U.S. diplomat that some people say gave the green light to Saddam Hussein to invade because he basically asks her, what would the U.S. do if he basically hints that if we went to war with Kuwait, without saying those words exactly. And she said, we have no opinion on your Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait. And so here you can see this one article that's going back and forth on, was this or was this not a green light? So some people say, Saddam Hussein was basically encouraged, and others say, no, this wasn't what April Gillespie meant, and she shouldn't be blamed for this. Long story short, this is going to lead to an attack on Iraq by the U.S. and their allies. And then things get really bad after a terrorist attack, which we'll study in chapter 40 called the Scepter of September 11th or the 9/11 attacks. This was an attack that was not perpetrated by Iraq. There was no connection between Al-Qaeda and Iraq, but this was used as a justification for a preemptive war against Iraq to oust Saddam Hussein by George W. Bush as part of the War on Terror. And this is really controversial. One of the ways that the American public was sold on going to war with Iraq was because George W. Bush claimed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and other people claim that no, this was really a war about oil. So, for example, you can see this, just a random slideshow that I find. Does Saddam Hussein have anything to do with 9/11? No, this isn't true. In September 2003, President Bush admitted publicly that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with the September 11th attacks. These were preemptive attacks, supposedly over weapons of mass destruction. And there are some great political cartoons that you can find. This one obviously makes the case that this was largely a war about oil. So, this weapons of mass destruction was highly debated at that time, but you may not know this if you weren't alive at the time. Eventually, Saddam Hussein is captured and hanged. And you can find this on the internet, so you shouldn't watch it. It would disturb you. I really dislike watching acts of violence and war, but even to people who, hurt others, and Saddam Hussein obviously hurt others. I have cousins that were tortured by Saddam Hussein, that went to jail and were tortured and received a stipend from the Iraqi government now for what they suffered. So obviously he was not a well-liked figure by many in Iraq, but this war was something that we could debate. Whether it was morally correct or not to go to war with a sovereign state is something that we could continue to discuss. And we'll continue to study Iraq and what's happening in Iraq in Chapter 40.